Hey everybody, I just want to put out a quick PSA because we're continuing to see confusion around the concept of like perfectly rolled aspects, the Codex of Power not working, salvaging aspects being bugged in some way. Well, OP and many people in this Reddit, many people still believe that you can get a perfect aspect, salvage it, and then you won't have a perfect version of that aspect in your Codex of Power to imprint later. People think that salvaging just isn't working. And while luckily, OP here and the person originally who posted like the, hey, this is what's really happening, got the majority of people on board with it, we are still getting posts about this. So this was 4 days ago. I also saw one earlier today when I was scrolling through Reddit where somebody's like, hey, I salvaged an aspect and it didn't work. Well, let's look at why people are believing this, because it's completely logical. And like, that's the major problem about this. These people aren't wrong, but what they're attributing it to is wrong, because in-game it is working how it's supposed to. Just how it's supposed to work, I think, is ultimately a failure and just needs to be redone. So if I were bartering here and I saw this mace and it has the blighted aspect on it, because it's a two-handed weapon, that means it's twice as strong. And the range for this mace, for the blighted aspect, is between 35 and 50, which when you double it onto a two-handed weapon is 70 to 100. That's what it says is the biggest aspect that you could possibly get in the game, which isn't wrong, but it's because this item isn't ancestral. Let's go ahead and look at the blighted aspect in my Codex of Power. So if I were to look up blighted and we were to go look at what value it can get up to, you can see that it does have a minimum of 35, but it can roll all the way up to 55. So on a two-handed weapon, the range for this should actually be 70 to 110. How come this mace doesn't show this information when it's right here in my codex? That's because the blighted aspect on a non-ancestral piece of gear, meaning a piece of gear that doesn't have a greater affix on it, that isn't item power 800, can only get up to 100. So a perfect aspect for a non-ancestral piece of gear is actually 100. It's not lying to you. It's just telling you the truth in a completely unintuitive and like illogical way that doesn't allow you to then inform yourself about what is possible in the game. And it leads to some very weird outcomes. Have you noticed that the majority of your aspects at this point all seem to be stuck somewhere around 16 to 21? And in fact, if I were to just like look at all of the aspects that I have, you'll notice that very few of mine are above 16. It's either 16 or 21. There's kind of no in between here. Like, yeah, like I have like a 20 here, but the vast majority of them either haven't even found a perfect for a non-ancestral piece of gear or haven't found an ancestral perfect aspect. Why is that? Well, it turns out that the requirements to get a perfect aspect are like apparently near astronomically impossible. We're going to go ahead and use my ancestral amulet as an example here. So Bloodseekers can roll all the way up to 45%. I could technically have a 45% damage aspect here, but that's only possible on an ancestral piece of gear. Basically, regular legendary piece of gear gets stuck at 16 out of 21, and then ancestral goes all the way up to 21. But you can't get a perfect aspect on a legendary piece of gear. It has to be an ancestral legendary piece of gear, which adds on to the RNG that you need to roll in the first place to even find the piece of gear. So let's just look at that, right? If I were to look at everything that's currently being offered in my barter, and I haven't bought any of the items, there were no ancestral pieces of gear here. Now, if I were to open up all the caches that I got, let's see how many ancestral pieces of gear I drop out of all of these caches. That was none. I was actually expecting to hit at least one, I'll be honest with you. I opened up a megaton of caches. I didn't get a single ancestral piece of gear. And if I were to then look through these, while I did find a perfect aspect, I found a perfect non-ancestral aspect. So this is deflecting barrier. On this piece of gear, deflecting barrier only goes up to 10%. And as you can see, my deflecting barrier is at 10%, and I haven't found a perfect version of it yet, which will only be a whopping 12%. But I just haven't found one because I would have to find it on an ancestral piece of gear. So I have to find a gear piece that can have the aspect that I want. It has to roll as an ancestral piece of gear, which is a fairly low chance at this point. And then the aspect can roll from the original minimum value all the way up to the new maximum value. So if I were to find Bloodseekers on my amulet right now, it could have a 15% roll on it, a 16%, a 17, etc. Or it could have a perfect roll, right? So it's quite literally harder to find an aspect that rolls perfect because there's more numbers it could roll as on a piece of gear that has to be ancestral, that also has to be a piece of gear that can have the aspect on it that you need in the first place. That many ifs, like that many question marks, that many rolls of the dice is why basically none of us have ancestral aspects. It's why almost none of us have perfect aspects in the first place. And not only that, if you were to use any third-party trade sites, you would see perfect aspects on there going for tens and dozens of billions of gold. That's how rare they are. So this is what's causing the confusion. You have a perfect aspect, you salvage it, you go into your Codex of Power, and it's not 21 out of 21. It's stuck at 16 out of 21 or 11 out of 15. For whatever reason, that's the number differentiator there. And you go, what the heck, I've been scammed. You haven't. But here are my recommendations to the developers, because there's really a couple easy fixes here as far as I'm concerned. One, always show the maximum range of the aspect. While some people might get confused and not understand why they can't find a perfect aspect on a non-ancestral piece of gear, they will at least not suffer the other side of the confusion, which is thinking that they're getting scammed and that there are bugs in the game. They'll just consider themselves unlucky or that drop rates are weird in some way, instead of quite literally thinking that they managed to succeed at something that they didn't and then got completely ripped off. When an ancestral piece of gear drops in the game, the minimum roll of the aspect should always be at least what a perfect version on a non-ancestral piece of gear is. So if this was an ancestral piece of gear and rolled as a 10, I would say, okay, I at least found a perfect version of a non-ancestral aspect. Now I can check that off the board, but it will also mean that I'm more likely to get damage ranges or values inside of the top end of what it can be. I might not get the perfect 12, I might get an 11, I might get a 10, but I'm never getting worse than the maximum of a non-ancestral piece of gear. Because here's the thing, I think I've found 2 relevant perfect aspects this season. One for an aspect nobody uses, which is accelerating, so I can get my whopping 30% attack speed. And I also found a 45% roll on reanimation for minions. The funny part being, though, is that since it was on a gear piece that I needed to use for a build, it was a ancestral piece of gear in the first place, right? It already has a huge amount of value. I would have to salvage it to have that forever, meaning that there are also circumstances where you find a perfect aspect and you have to choose to throw away an amazingly powerful piece of gear or give up that aspect to be able to use it one way or the other. So that's like already a huge decision that gets made item to item. And the fact that it's so rare that it causes this frustration at this top end is also just a bad outcome as far as I'm concerned. Make aspects on ancestral pieces of gear minimum roll at the highest that they can for non-ancestral. That will drastically increase the chances of us actually finding perfect aspects in the first place, which are meant to be one of the foundationally reliable sources of power, right? Like finding a perfect piece of gear is really hard, but at least your aspects won't be the thing holding you back. I have been using this 19 out of 25 and 38 out of 50 roll on Grasping Veins since day 2 of this season, because quite literally, I've never found a better one, which seems insane to me. Look at all of the gear that I have. Look at the multitudes of builds that I've actually built. Each line here is a completely separate build of a fully geared character that I've made. I have not found a higher aspect than this on one of the quintessentially most important aspects for the Necromancer. Help me out here, Blizzard. Like, throw us a bone. But there you go. I just want to put this out there. Hopefully it helps to alleviate some of the confusion, or at least explain to you why, yes, you're completely correct logically. Just know you're not getting scammed. The game's just telling it to you in a very weird way. And hopefully my wish list is something that the developers are considering doing, because I think it would alleviate a lot of the pain points that people are experiencing in these weird like gear gatekeeps that they have no power to like positively impact. I'm not finding them through bartering. I'm not finding them through gambling. I'm not finding them through running hordes. I'm not finding them through running dungeons. I'm not finding them through running Undercity. I'm just not finding them. It would be cool to at least say my aspects are done for the season. But thank you very much for watching this video. I truly, truly hope that helps. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.